But what if those efforts do not work? What would an actual Chinese invasion look like? We do have a reference point to look at, and that is Ukraine. The whole world is feeling the effect of Russia's war. Our fuel is more expensive, our food prices are rising, our energy bills are too high, but a war in Taiwan would be even worse. Think of it like this. If the Ukraine war is a sword fight, a Taiwan war will be a shootout, and I'll tell you why. First, because of the parties involved. Both Russia and Ukraine are financially weak. Their combined GDP is around $1.7 trillion. Compare that to Taiwan and China. China alone has a GDP of $12 trillion. Taiwan's GDP is around $650 billion. So the shock to the global economy is going to be huge. Also, there is a possibility of outside intervention. I'm talking about the United States. If Joe Biden does intervene, all bets are off. Two of the biggest economies in the world would be in direct war. 3. If Japan decides to get involved, there'll be 3. In such a scenario, world trade would completely collapse. Let me show you some numbers. China makes up 12.4% of world trade. That's both imports and exports put together. The US makes up 8.1%. What about Taiwan? It makes up 1.7% of all global exports. In simple words, they're more integrated into the world economy, which was not the case with Ukraine and Russia. Both countries sell gas and grains. Important, yes, but not enough to derail global trade as we know it. And the idea behind this report is not to be alarmist. This is a dispassionate assessment of what the near future may look like. Another reason why this war would hurt more is the location of the conflict. Ukraine is tucked away near the Black Sea. Taiwan is centrally located in the Indo-Pacific. It straddles one of the busiest shipping routes in the world. Almost 33% of seaborne trade goes through this region. If it becomes a battleground, the impact would be immeasurable. And I mean it, literally. It's impossible to predict what kind of hit our world economy would take. The biggest casualty would be electronics, it's safe to say. Taiwan is the biggest manufacturer of semiconductors. They make up around half of all exports. If China attacks, that trade would ground to a halt. Either the PLA army will destroy the factories or they'll take control of them. Either way, there is going to be chip shortage. And we experienced a similar situation during the pandemic. Taiwan's chip exports slowed down in 2020. Do you remember the consequence? Mobile phones became more expensive. Vehicles were unavailable. There were long waiting periods. Computers could not be manufactured. Basically, the technology industry came to a standstill. A war would be even worse because China is also a technology powerhouse. Their biggest exports are computers, phones, machine parts. If the PLA goes to war, industries will shift focus. They won't be exporting smartphones then. They will recalibrate to bolster the army, to build radars, engines, ammunition. And don't forget the sanctions. Both the US and China will likely wage an economic war. How would that play out? The Americans will probably try to squeeze China's energy imports, basically ground the PLA war machine. The Chinese will probably seize US assets in China, perhaps use cyber attacks to disable American networks. And this back and forth would ruin both economies. In fact, the RAND Corporation has published a study on how this economic war would play out. They say America's GDP will fall by 5 to 10%, China's by 25 to 35%. For the world, it would be a global economic emergency, or simply put, a recession. So that is the economic cost of a Taiwan invasion. What about the political cost? Will a victorious China stop at Taiwan? Chances are they won't, which means countries in the Indo-Pacific must prepare for war. In other words, an arms race. Japan, for instance, will have to immediately suspend pacificism. They will have no option but to arm themselves. A former Pentagon official is already suggesting this. His name is Elbridge Colby. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under Donald Trump. Now, Colby says Japan must triple its defense spending immediately. Right now, they spend just 1% of their GDP on defense. If Taiwan falls, they may have to increase it to 2 to 3%. Same with the ASEAN state. They will have two options against a belligerent China: either succumb to Beijing's pressure or arm themselves for deterrence. And what I just described is a hypothetical situation. Actually, scratch that. It's a hypothetical nightmare. A world crippled by shortages and recession, an Indo-Pacific armed to the teeth, and the world's biggest economies locked in war. It may not be a global war, but it will be a global economic crisis, make no mistake. So both Joe Biden and Xi Jinping must exercise restraint. The cost of a war in the Taiwan Strait is simply too high. It would set the world back by years, if not decades. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.